Hello, fellow risk takers, and welcome to my worst investment ever. Stories of loss to keep you winning. In our community, we know that to win in investing, you must take risk, but to win big, you've got to reduce it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm on a mission to help 1 million people reduce risk in their lives. And that mission has led me to create the Become a Better Investor community. In the community, you get access to our global asset allocation strategies and stock portfolios, our institutional grade investment research, weekly live sessions, and the risk reduction lessons I've learned from more than 500 guests. Go to myworstinvestmentever.com right now to claim your 50% lifetime discount exclusive for podcast listeners. Fellow risk takers, this is your worst podcast host, Andrew Stotz from A Stotz Academy, and I'm here with featured guests Mark Graban. Mark, are you ready to join the mission?
I am, and hopefully I'm not your worst guest ever.
I have a feeling you will not be. And the reason, ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear when I introduce Mark. So Mark Graban is an author, speaker, consultant, and podcaster. His podcasts include Lean Blog Interviews, Habitual Excellence, and My Favorite Mistake. He's also affiliated with the technology company KaiNexus and the healthcare advisory firm Value Capture. His books include his most recent titled Measures of Success, React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. He has a BS in Industrial Engineering from Northwestern University and an MS and an MBA from MIT. His website with all of his books, podcasts, and much more is markgraban.com, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. Mark, take a moment and tell us about the unique value that you bring to this wonderful world.
That's a really, it's a big, heady, important question. I should really think and reflect more about that. I mean, I think one unique thing, I'm a dot connector, I think. If there's a theme to the work that I do, I've helped people in healthcare connect the dots to practices from improvement and management practices that come from other industries. I help people connect the dots between methods like, from my book, Measures of Success, of literally connecting the dots, I guess, in a chart that shows performance, whether it's a stock or a business measure over time, connecting the dots and learning how to use those charts in a more effective way to make better decisions. And then I like to connect dots between my podcast guests and listeners across different fields. So I guess I'll wear that label. I'm a dot connector.
Interesting. And tell us, how did you come up with your idea on, first of all, you got 3 podcasts, which, most of my listeners are thinking, oh my goodness, I'm just trying to figure out how to start one. And for me, I already know it's hard enough to run one. Tell us why you have 3 and tell us a little bit about them and kind of what's going on with them.
Yeah, so I started my first back in 2006. I mean, this was back, I don't know if you were listening to the podcast, you would have to download them to an MP3 player. Like, it was a really clunky process, but that one has a clunky name, Lean Blog Interviews. I have a website, leanblog.org. The name was probably a mistake, but it is what it is. I've done more than 450 interviews with people in that field of what we call lean management in different industries. And then these other 2 were honestly pandemic projects. Middle of 2020, not being able to travel, trying to do a number of things that are helpful. So through that firm, Value Capture, I started a podcast called Habitual Excellence, where we interview clients of that firm and some of the people at that firm. And then I started My Favorite Mistake as a podcast in September of 2020, because this idea of learning from mistakes and embracing that and celebrating it and getting better at it, including starting with myself, that's a topic I've been fascinated with for years, and exploring that in the podcast has been great. So I love podcasting. I try to do it in a fairly efficient way, so it's not super time consuming, but they're all either a labor of love or part of my job, or labor of love, or both, really.
And how do people react when you ask them to come on the show for My Favorite Mistake?
The response has actually been a lot better. Like I feared maybe a lot of people wouldn't come on a podcast and talk about their mistakes.
Mm.
The first guest, and I think he set the tone perfectly, Kevin Harrington, who was one of the sharks on the US version of the show Shark Tank, as an investor and as an entrepreneur. And he was willing to come on and be really vulnerable and tell a story about kind of early days. He's considered the inventor of the modern infomercial. He made a mistake that almost put his company out of business, but he embraced the mistake. He didn't blame others. He owned it. He put some changes in place to make sure that mistake wouldn't happen again. And I think it's one of the things that set him up for success. So having the first guest means you have one guest. I was afraid that maybe quickly it would dwindle down because people want to come on a podcast a lot of times and promote their new book, or they want to promote their successes and they want to focus on that. But finding people who are willing to come on and share a favorite mistake story, I think there's this mix of being brave and humble that I've really enjoyed doing those interviews and getting to meet people that way.
It's a little bit like with my podcast. I say my podcast is about authenticity. This is a place where we share, our worst. And I'm the worst podcast host, so don't worry about it. It's going to be bad.
Well, and thank you for convincing me. You took a couple swings at saying, well, come on, because I said, I don't know if I have an investment story. Like, I'm not afraid to talk about failures or mistakes, but I think we figured out some things we can talk about. So thank you for
Mark. One of my favorite replies when I ask someone to come on the show, he says, "Good idea, not my style."
Yeah. Yeah, and that happens sometimes, and if someone doesn't want to talk about a mistake, okay, fine. There's plenty of, if you will, generic business podcasts where they can go and
Pump
just
you
be
up.
given an open forum. But a show like yours, a show like mine, it's unique, and I think our podcasts are kindred spirits.
So for the listeners and the viewers out there, take a moment and think about it. I know this morning I was jumping in the shower and I was thinking about our conversation we're going to have tonight, and I was thinking about, what was I guess I didn't think my favorite mistake. I was thinking my worst mistake or my biggest mistake and all that.
And those might be different.
Yeah. But for the listeners out there, think about it. What was your biggest, your favorite, your worst? What was a mistake that you learned from and you grew from? I thought a lot about that, and I've come up with mine, and maybe someday I'll come on and share that with you.
I hope so, but you summarized it really well. What makes it a favorite mistake is that it led to something positive. It may have taken time for that to happen, but growth, or sometimes a mistake ends up opening a door that wouldn't have been an option. So that's part of the framing. It's a subjective question, but favorite may or may not be the same as biggest.
Yep. Well, now it's time to share your worst investment ever. And since no one goes into their worst investment thinking it will be, tell us a bit about the circumstances leading up to it, and then tell us your story.
Yeah, so the year, I think this was early 2000. And, I was young. I barely had a retirement account. I was sort of trying to get started with that. And, I was working in technology at the time, and somebody I worked with, for whatever reason, say, oh, I got to tell you about this stock I invested, and it's skyrocketed and I've made a lot of money. And it was a company called Commerce One. This was back in like the Y2K e-commerce B2B frenzy. I didn't know what the company did. I mean, there was this vague description of it. I certainly didn't do any sort of research. I didn't look at the numbers. My friend said the stock's been going up, and I made the mistake of thinking like, well, that means it's going to continue going up. Well, that's a bad assumption, right? So I think I put something like maybe $4,000 into it. And before long, I think the value had fallen by about 50%, right? So this wasn't money that was going to, bankrupt me or make me homeless. But I think it reinforced that lesson of being careful about choosing individual stocks, and either letting professionals do it through diversified mutual funds or index funds, or and So I thought, okay, well, lesson learned. I'm not a stock picker. I don't have time to do research. At least I made the mistake young and with a relatively small amount of money, right? Could have been worse.
Mm. And I think you're going to talk about another story too, about some discovery that you've gotten in your life.
Yeah, so this is where, I think, this goes in a little bit different direction when you talk about investments. Investing time in things that just don't work. Humans can be stubborn. I was stubborn, and I'll set the context, or I'll tell you what I recently learned and kind of go back and think of what that bad investment in time and effort was. So I'm 48 years old, going on 49 in a couple of months. I was recently formally diagnosed, and I sought this out, but it was confirmed as having ADHD. And that's something that I think I knew, I did know really for 20 or 25 years, that I was in denial about this, of struggles with attentiveness, apparently, especially at work, in meetings and conferences. This can be a blessing and a curse. My mind will wander. I think I have a very curious, creative mind. But there was a time maybe 12 years ago where I did get scolded when I was a consultant, and the client kind of complained to the head of the firm that my quote unquote multitasking, like when one of the other consultants was leading the training, I thought, well, I've heard this all before. I'm going to let him present. I'm not going to jump in and interrupt, but be on my laptop. And they'd say, well, it looks like Mark's not very interested. He's not engaged. He's not, oops. But that could have or should have been a wake-up call to try to get more serious help. But the bad investment, I thought I needed to just care more, and I thought I needed to try harder. And I would sort of blame myself, if not sort of shaming myself for not paying attention. And there were a number of things that sort of lined up in this past year. Thankfully, there was not a life-altering moment where I haven't lost a job about this, but like the two sides of the coin, this was a wake-up call that ADHD is not just about inattentiveness. The same part of the brain that makes it hard to control where your attention goes is the same part of the brain that can make it hard for someone to regulate emotion, right? So if I get upset about something, I have trouble holding that in, sometimes to my own detriment. And so there were some moments like that where I did feel like I was starting to damage some relationships work-wise. And I saw an article about this connection, and that was really the light bulb moment of realizing, okay, you know what? I'm going to stop being in denial about it. I'm going to stop investing time into trying to care more or trying harder. That's just not how my brain works. And so getting that diagnosis, now there's an investment in treatments. There are medications that are incredibly effective. And as I've learned, the final thing about this, like, I think there's a difference between those moments when we choose to not pay attention. Like, we all do that, right? If something's boring or not interesting, we can choose to not pay attention. ADHD treatments do not magically make boring things interesting. But here's the thing that has made a huge difference to me, even in a month, is when you want to pay attention to something, the medication and the treatment allows you to maintain that focus. And that's where I felt like I was missing out. I was shortchanging clients. I was shortchanging myself. And those cycles of then feeling bad about struggling to pay attention to something I wanted to pay attention to, that made it even harder to pay attention. If I'm fixating now on what's wrong with me, why can't I pay attention? I think the quote unquote, and that's not the right way to say it, what's different about me and people who have ADHD is that our brains are wired a little differently. And if we want to address that, medications can help without changing who we are or how we think. Just that ability to focus is something I'm grateful for, and I regret not doing something about it 10, 15, 20 years ago.
So how would you describe the lessons that you've learned from this experience?
I think it's one of those, I think there's a number of lessons. One is not to be in denial about things. I've interviewed on the My Favorite Mistake podcast different counselors and therapists, and like there's this common theme, whether it's ADHD or maybe other mental health questions of, if you even think you might have a problem, you probably have a problem, or at the very least, it's worth talking to a professional to get help, depending on the situation, whether that means counseling or therapy or medication or all of the above. I think there's a lesson in, not shaming yourself for your differences. If you have trouble fitting into a world that's generally created and managed by people without ADHD, it can be hard to feel like you're not fitting in the way you might want to or might need to. And so one reason I've been open about ADHD within the two companies I'm involved in, sharing with friends on Facebook, is that I think there are a lot of people like me who have had these doubts or these questions. And like me, they've either been in denial, they've tried compensating in different ways. And so for one, it's helpful when others speak up and say, hey, me too. Like, let me share my experiences. Let me do what I can to be supportive or helpful. And then I think being willing to share and disclose things like this helps others maybe decide if they want to take action, right? So I've had a guest recently on My Favorite Mistake who was very vulnerable and open in talking about his past battles with depression. And I think him sharing that and being willing to do so creates space for others, even if they don't want to speak up publicly, maybe to reflect and realize that there is help. And especially if someone has ADHD, there are treatments that are incredibly effective with basically zero risk of side effect. And I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert in this, but I guess if somebody listening says, gosh, that might be me, I have some of these struggles, you can talk to a counselor, you can talk to a physician, maybe ideally someone who's more of a specialist in ADHD, to make sure you're getting maybe the latest and best advice.
Got it. So maybe I'll summarize what I took away. One of the things that you talked about was that, it's not a matter of trying to care more, try harder, like all of a sudden the pieces of the puzzle, you started off this whole thing by saying that you're good at connecting the dots.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that was a place where you weren't connecting the dots, and then all of a sudden they came together.
Right. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
you also,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I might not always be the fastest at connecting the dots, but
Yeah, well, sometimes
was
we're
some,
good at connecting other people's dots or other situations or external or whatever, but sometimes our internal dots are the hardest ones.
yeah.
You talked about the blame and shame, factor, and I know no matter what is happening in our lives, we can feel blame, we can feel shame about things that are going on. And, you talked then about the idea of talking about it and then seeking some help and the relief that that provides. So
Yes.
those are some, powerful things for the listeners who are struggling with anything, talk about it. Don't be afraid to talk about it. You sent me an email kind of mentioning about it a while ago, and I didn't mention, but in 1972, I was diagnosed with ADHD.
Oh.
And I was 7 years old, and I found out about it from my mom when she gave me this booklet she kept where she wrote notes about my health and medical. And I saw that they started to put me on what was a magical drug at the time called Ritalin, and I was 7, and it probably helped me, I'm sure, in some way. But one of the things that happened in my life is by the time I was in high school, I was pretty heavily addicted to drugs. Now, whether that came from the Ritalin or not is, up for debate. But certainly I faced a lot of struggles trying to overcome that. I went into rehab and eventually got sober. And in September of this year, it will be 40 years that I've been sober. And
That's great.
what that basically means is that I can't treat my ADHD with drugs. It's just too dangerous for my situation because as an addict, it's just going to bring me down a road that I don't want to be down, you know.
Sure. Sure.
And so therefore I've had to kind of deal with it in different ways. And
Hmm.
one of the ways that I've dealt with it is I've surrounded myself with what I call steady eddies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've got some really great people that are really steady in what they do every single day. And I'm a roller coaster. You know, when I'm flying high and I'm really cranking, you know, it's
Yeah.
like I'm unbeatable. But
Well,
then I
yeah,
crash.
there's that hyper focus, right?
Correct.
If there's something I mean that ability, it's two sides of the coin, right? The ability to really hyper focus and get things done if it interests you and your
Mm,
brain
yep.
at that moment, that's powerful. No, it's just to share, and again, not a doctor, not a clinician, not an expert, but there's a lot of information out there, Andrew, about how ADHD and addiction are very highly correlated. That the part of the brain that the dopamine receptors that
Mm,
don't work as well in the ADHD brain. A lot of people self-medicate, unfortunately. So
yep.
alcohol abuse rates, drug abuse rates are far higher than the general population
Yeah.
as a way of compensating.
I wouldn't doubt that. And I remember, I'll tell you a story, Mark. When I met a young lady in Thailand and I asked her, what do you do? And we were in a, social setting. And she says,
Mhm.
I help, kids with ADHD. And she said to me, I said, well, tell me more about that. And I didn't tell her anything about, myself, but and she said, I really feel sorry for these kids because they can't concentrate and they're jumping up and down and, they're all over the place and all
Mhm.
that. And, what my reply to her at some point, I stopped and I said, well, you know, I was one of those kids. And nowadays, when I look at it a little bit differently. I think, you know, and particularly after watching the last couple of years of, I would say, a lot of sheep, a lot of
Mhm.
people just following blindly.
Mhm.
And I would say that, in my perspective, the 100 kids, the 99 kids that are sitting quietly listening to a boring lecture at a young
Mhm.
age, they're the ones that aren't normal.
Well, there's differences there, right?
Yeah, that was what I said. When I look back at myself now, I think I just love my brain and I love my
Yeah.
intensity and I love my roller coaster. And yeah, I could, I could try to do something with it, but I decided that, well, the risk is too high for me to do the medication angle.
Mhm.
And
Sure.
therefore, it's really just a matter of, okay, how do I deal with it? And, I'm an up and down guy. When I'm up, yeah, I'm really good. When I'm down, you just don't hear from me because I'm tired and I'm in bed and I'm
Yeah.
relaxing and
Yeah.
sleeping. And then I'll be back, boom, with hyper
Yeah.
focus and energy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd suggest also, I mean, I think it took me a while with my career to find a setting that more often than not allows the benefits of the way my brain works to
Mm,
shine, right? So me going to the same cubicle every day, doing the same work, and that is not a fit for me. But doing things that are more entrepreneurial, being a consultant, working with different clients, different learning, different stimulation, different environments is good for me. I've heard, like, for example, a lot of emergency room physicians are probably far more ADHD than the general public because there's that adrenaline rush and there's
yep.
that constant newness. Now, at some point, you might get really bored of seeing the same type of case coming in
Mm,
over and over. But there's always that possibility of, like, oh, okay, something really interesting, unique, is coming in. So, maybe people have to find a good fit. And like you said, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, find people who can do the steady, routine, regular things so that your creativity and your gifts are a huge benefit.
yeah, yeah. No, it's great. It's a great reminder. And I know for everybody out there, ideally, you've got a couple different things. If something's not working right in your life, take a lesson from Mark and ask questions, try to get help
Mhm.
and get support. But also take another lesson, and that is that, you know, you're beautiful as you are, too.
Mhm.
Don't feel like, I'm wrong, I'm bad, I'm this, I'm that. become more
Sure.
of yourself.
Mhm.
And, I would say that to me is kind of the big journey of what life is really about.
Mhm.
So let me ask you, what is a resource that of yours that you'd recommend for our listeners?
Well, around, the podcast, My Favorite Mistake, you can go to
Mm,
myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. Um, in a way, I've sort of reflected on this. Like the title, the phrase "my favorite mistake" comes from a Sheryl Crow song from the '90s. Do you know that song, Andrew? It was my favorite mistake,
I don't remember it.
and it's
I
about,
remember Sheryl Crow.
yeah, it's about a love mistake. It was one of her hits. So unfortunately, like I mean, it's a great phrase. There's nothing legally preventing me from using it. But if people go and search, let's say Spotify, for just my favorite mistake, they're going to find all the different versions of that Sheryl Crow song. So people may need to search my favorite mistake podcast in Spotify or Apple or wherever. But I hope people will check it out because again, the tone of the podcast is not about shaming people for their mistakes. It's to embrace and celebrate the authenticity, the openness, the willingness to share, and I think that inspires others to
Mhm.
remember we all make mistakes. We should be ideally learning from our mistakes and finding this balance of not beating ourselves up or shaming ourselves for it, but maybe reflecting, taking ownership, and then moving forward, right? We don't want to dwell on mistakes. I think that can then be harmful or counterproductive. But I would invite people to check out the podcast. I hope it
Yeah.
inspires them and helps them think through their own mistakes, their own professional lives, or their lives in general.
And there's even easier way to find it, Mark. Just go to the podcast, myworstinvestmentever.com show notes, and I'm going to have
Yeah,
that and the links to everything of yours in there.
great.
So, last
Thanks.
question.
Mhm.
What's your number one goal for the next 12 months?
So my number one goal, and I've started on it and working toward it, is that I am writing a book that's based on the lessons from the My Favorite Mistake podcast series, the stories and the reflections from those different guests, and a little bit of my own reflections and experiences. I think first off, on an individual level, helping people think through how do I process and learn from mistakes as an individual. And then I think even more powerful is the lessons from guests who have talked about creating a culture in their company where it's safe for people to talk about mistakes and that they're not blamed or punished or fired, but the organization learns and gets better.
Mm,
So those are I think the two main themes of the book, lessons for individuals, lessons for organizations. I don't know what I'm going to call the book yet. I'm writing without knowing exactly what the title is. That happens, but there'll be some phrase, and I hope that book reaches people. Not everyone, and people maybe should, not everyone listens to podcasts. They
mm,
should be. They should be
yeah,
listening to your podcast, Andrew. But
yeah.
I think the book will reach people in a different way than the
How
podcast
long
does.
will it take you to write it, you think?
That's a good question. When I've written books before, it's usually anywhere from about 6 to 9 months of writing, but that's finding time within all the other things that I'm still doing. So it's not a
Mm,
full-time job. I can't
yeah.
stop the world and say, hey, maybe I should, take a week off and go to a cabin somewhere and write the book. But it percolates, I think about it. I get writing done, come back to it. That's what my process has been.
Got it.
And it's as far as ADHD goes, sometimes the stereotypical typical thing would be starting projects and not finishing them. Thankfully, I've gotten different books across the finish line, but I think it's more what you're alluding to, Andrew. When the hyper focus is there, when it's a topic that I love, it's not
Mm.
hard to be motivated or to be attentive.
Yeah, and when you go to that cabin, why don't you just go relax, enjoy yourself?
Well, I might need to do that for a while before then I feel ready. So maybe it's got to be 2 weeks, 1 week to
Yep,
relax, 1 week to write.
bam. Well, listeners, there you have it, another story of loss to keep you winning. If you haven't yet joined the Become a Better Investor community, just go to myworstinvestmentever.com right now to claim your 50% lifetime discount exclusive for podcast listeners. As we conclude, Mark, I want to thank you again for joining our mission. And on behalf of A Stotz Academy, I hereby award you alumni status for turning your worst investment ever into your best teaching moment. Do you have any parting words for the audience?
Well, I think as you've asked people to think and reflect, I love that you're doing that, and this idea of being willing to share a story where we didn't have our greatest success, but something that was a learning moment for ourselves. I think there's cases where like people could learn from my mistake. Be really careful choosing individual stocks, but I think there's a higher lesson there of embracing the idea of transparency and openness. To if you've made a mistake at work, hopefully you're in an environment where you can tell your coworkers, I made a mistake, let's address it in a constructive way. If people aren't in that environment, then at least maybe internally or with themselves, that they can at least admit mistakes to themselves and move forward in a better way. So I think we're on the same page of asking or inviting people to reflect and think to themselves, or share the story with someone close to them, or maybe even on a podcast.
Fantastic. Well, that's a wrap on another great story to help us create, grow, and protect our wealth and, as Mark has taught us, our health. Fellow risk takers, let's celebrate that today we added one more person to our mission to help 1 million people reduce risk in their lives. This is your worst podcast host, Andrew Stotz, saying, I'll see you on the upside.